What are the fastest depreciating cars that you should avoid? That's what we're going to find out. Welcome to Car Help Corner, where we help you, the consumer, master the process of car buying and car ownership. Resale value might not always be at the top of mind when choosing a new car, but it really should be, because buying a car that tanks in value is the easiest way to throw your money down the drain. And I'm going to show you which cars depreciate so fast that they actually lose half their value in only 3 years. This data comes from CarEdge, and I've broken the data down into 3 different lists. We'll first go through the top 10 luxury cars that lose value the fastest, then we'll go over the top 10 non-luxury cars from regular brands. And then finally, we'll go through the top 10 cars that have the best resale value that you should go for instead. But first, we'll begin with the top 10 luxury cars, starting with the first one in the number 10 spot, which is the Mercedes GLE. The GLE loses around 47% of its value, or approximately $40,000 US, within the first 3 years. A rule of thumb with European luxury cars is that heavy depreciation is basically a given, because they are generally known for being somewhat unreliable and insanely expensive to repair. The value plummets rapidly, especially as the warranty is about to expire. Which is the same situation for the next vehicle in the number 9 spot, which is the Audi S8. The S8 loses around 47% of its value, or the equivalent of a whopping $65,000 US, within the first 3 years of ownership. An incredible 33% of that loss is only after the first year. Pretty wild. And the next vehicle that comes at number 8 is the Maserati Levante. Again, with this model, you'll see a 47% drop, or the equivalent of $55,000 within the first 3 years. A pretty incredible loss. And the vehicle just ahead of that at number 7 is the Land Rover Range Rover. This one should be really no surprise. Range Rovers lose around 47% of their value, or around $68,000 US, within the first 3 years, which is just mind-boggling. Again, no one wants to take a chance on one of these once the warranty expires, given that they are so unreliable and horribly expensive to repair, so the value plummets accordingly. And next up in the number 6 spot, we have the Audi S5. These lose around 48% of their value, or around $30,000 US, in the first 3 years. Not as bad as the others, but the S5 is not as expensive to buy brand new. Still, a big loss in a pretty short time. And next up at number 5, we have the Alfa Romeo Stelvio. These lose around 49% of their value, or around $28,000 in the first 3 years. 30% of that loss, however, is in the first year alone, which tells you that these vehicles are just overpriced. And the vehicle that we have at number 4, which is a frequent frontrunner for fastest depreciating cars, is the BMW 7 Series. These lose around 49%, or the equivalent of $65,000 in value, in the first 3 years. That sounds pretty painful, but no surprise really. The 7 Series is not a very popular car, and even less so when they are used, due to fear of high repair costs. And coming in at number 3, we have the Tesla Model X. These lose around 50%, or around $45,000 of value in the first 3 years, largely due to the Model X simply not being a very popular choice anymore, and therefore a victim of heavy depreciation. And for the number 2 vehicle, we have the Maserati Ghibli. These lose around 50% of their value, or the equivalent of $56,000 in the first 3 years. 35% of that loss, however, is in the first year alone, which is pretty wild. And for the number 1 luxury vehicle, we have the Audi e-tron, now known as the Q8 e-tron. These lose around 51% of their value, or around $42,000 in the first 3 years. There is one more honorable mention, however, which is currently projected to have even worse depreciation, and that car is the Mercedes EQS. The EQS already has a 1-year depreciation rate of 47%, and it's projected to lose around 65% of value after the first 3 years, which would mean an average loss of $75,000 US. As mentioned, what all these luxury vehicles have in common is that they're all known for being extremely expensive to repair and unreliable once they pass the warranty period. And this takes a major toll on the resale value. Some of these models are also quite unpopular with very limited demand, so that of course drags down the price as well. And some are also electric vehicles, which don't have much appeal on the used market because electric vehicles quickly become very dated with yesterday's technology that nobody wants. In the case of the EQS, it suffers from all three of these things, which is why the depreciation is so atrocious. Now, that list wasn't too surprising because most people know that luxury cars do not hold their value very well. But what about regular non-luxury cars? Well, there are still quite a few of these that can depreciate by between 40 and 50% within the first 3 years of ownership. And we're going to go over that list right now, starting with the first vehicle in the number 10 spot, which is the Ford Escape. The Ford Escape loses around 38%, or the equivalent of around $15,000 US within the first 3 years, which makes it a good used purchase, but not so much a good brand new one. And next up at number 9, we have the Dodge Charger. These lose around 40% of their value, or the equivalent of $19,000 US in the first 3 years. And moving on to the number 8 spot, we have the Nissan Murano. The Murano loses around 41%, or the equivalent of $19,000 in the first 3 years. 30% of that loss, however, is in the first year alone. Not too surprising, the Murano is just not a very popular SUV anymore, and its value drops accordingly. And for the next vehicle we have in the number 7 spot, that would be the Ford Expedition. The Expedition loses around 42% of its value, or the equivalent of $33,000 US within the first 3 years. Large, full-sized SUVs typically have heavy depreciation, and the Expedition is a great example of that. And next at number 6, we have the Buick Enclave. The Enclave loses 42%, or the equivalent of $23,000 in the first 3 years. And incredibly, 40% of that depreciation is after the first 2 years alone. Again, the Enclave is not a very popular vehicle, so its value drops accordingly. And for the next vehicle in the number 5 spot, we have the Chrysler Pacifica. The Pacifica loses 44%, or the equivalent of $22,000 in the first 3 years. And again, the majority of that is in the first and second year. By the second year, Pacificas lose 40% of their original value. Pretty incredible. And next at number 4, we have another Stellantis vehicle with the Jeep Grand Cherokee. Grand Cherokees lose 45%, or the equivalent of $25,000 within the first 3 years. And again, 32% of that value is lost within the first year alone, which tells you that the Grand Cherokee, like the Pacifica and many other Stellantis vehicles, are just way overpriced to begin with. And next up at number 3, we have another full-sized SUV with the Nissan Armada. The Armada loses 47%, or the equivalent of $33,000 within the first 3 years. Again, full-sized SUVs tend to drop a lot in value for being extremely expensive to begin with and not really that popular of a buy. And the Armada is a great example of that. And for the top 2 fastest depreciating regular vehicles, we have electric vehicles. The one coming in the number 2 spot is the Nissan Leaf. The Leaf loses 49%, or the equivalent to $19,000 within the first 3 years. And for the number 1 fastest depreciating vehicle, we have the Hyundai Kona Electric, losing 51%, or the equivalent of $19,000 within the first 3 years. And again, 33% of that loss is within the first year alone. As with luxury vehicles, a major part of the rapid depreciation of these regular vehicles has to do with popularity and general lack of demand. A lot of these rapidly depreciating models are vehicles that consumers are just not very interested in. A few of them are also electric vehicles, which again demonstrates that used EVs are not very desirable due to their dated technology and possible fear of battery failure as they age. And some of these vehicles depreciate rapidly because they are just too overpriced to begin with, or they have a poor reputation for quality and reliability, making them not very desirable as they age. And that brings us to our top 10 vehicles that have the best resale value, which is a major change from what we've seen so far. The vehicles on this list only lose an average of between 15 to 20% of their value within the first 3 years. That's roughly only 5 to 6% of a loss each year, which is not very much. And that's why these particular vehicles are just not good vehicles to buy on the used market, because they really don't drop very much in price. They make a lot more sense to just buy brand new. So let's get right into this list, starting with the first one in the number 10 spot, which is the Toyota Highlander. The Highlander only loses 23%, or the equivalent of $11,000 within the first 3 years. And just look at the depreciation graph when compared to what we've seen so far. We can see that it's a very gradual decline, which is exactly what you want to see from a vehicle that's very desirable, a lot of people want to buy, so it just doesn't depreciate very much. And next up in the number 9 spot, we have the Honda HR-V. The HR-V again only loses 23% of its value, or the equivalent of $6,700 within the first 3 years of ownership. And for the next vehicle that comes in at number 8, this is a very popular one. It's the Toyota RAV4. RAV4s only lose 22% of their value, or the equivalent of $8,200 within the first 3 years. And even moving beyond that, they only lose 27% by the time they're 5 years old. Really not much depreciation at all. They have incredibly high resale value, making them a great buy. And next up at number 7, we have the Toyota Corolla. The Corolla only loses 20% of its value, or the equivalent of only $5,000 within the first 3 years. Imagine losing less than $2,000 a year in value, especially when compared to some of the vehicles we saw a lot earlier. Pretty incredible. And next up in the number 6 spot, we have our first truck of the list, which is the Ford Ranger. The Ranger loses 20% of its value, or the equivalent of $8,800 within the first 3 years of ownership. Not bad at all. And next up at number 5, we have yet another Toyota, this time the Toyota Sienna. The Sienna only loses 18% of its value within the first 3 years, which is the equivalent of only $9,700. And just look at the depreciation from year 1 to year 3. Very little change year after year. So if you buy one of these, you're really not going to lose much value in the first few years of ownership. And for the next vehicle we have at number 4, it's the Toyota Land Cruiser. Land Cruisers only lose 18%, or the equivalent of $21,000 within the first 3 years of ownership. And for the number 3 spot, we have our first sports car of the list. This one is the Toyota Supra. Like the Land Cruiser, Supras only lose 18% of their value, the equivalent of around $11,000 within the first 3 years of ownership. And for the vehicle that comes in the number 2 spot, this one is the Toyota Tacoma. This is a vehicle that has long appeared on the best resale value list for many years now. The Tacoma only loses 17% of its value, the equivalent of $7,800 in the first 3 years of ownership. And even when they age well beyond that, the resale value still remains extremely strong. And for the number 1 vehicle of the list, this one came as a bit of a surprise, but it's the Ford Bronco. The Bronco only loses 16% of its value in the first 3 years of ownership, which is the equivalent of only $16,000. Now, some may wonder, where is the Jeep Wrangler, which has historically been among the top vehicles for best resale value? The issue with the Wrangler is that Jeep increased the pricing so much and caused sales to slow down, so the 3-year depreciation is now much higher than it was in the past. But it still has great resale value after 4 to 5 years and even beyond that. So for the most part, there's a very clear pattern in terms of which vehicles have the best resale value. Most of them are extremely popular, high demand vehicles that have excellent reputations when it comes to reliability and low ownership costs, which is why more than half of them are Toyotas. This is why I always say, don't just pay attention to the initial purchase price. It is okay to pay a bit more upfront if it means you're going to get a higher return in the long run through better reliability and better resale value. You always have to look at the total picture, not just the initial purchase price. And for those who are still not really convinced that resale value is that important because they're planning to perhaps keep the vehicle they buy forever until the wheels fall off, well, remember, you never know what could happen. Circumstances can always change, and you could eventually find yourself in a position where you need to sell or trade your vehicle a lot earlier than you were planning to. And if that were to happen, you're going to really wish you picked a vehicle that has really strong resale value. So what do you think? Is this information going to impact your decision in terms of which vehicle to buy? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. You can also take a look at my other videos by clicking the links up in the corner. You can follow me on Instagram, or if you need additional car buying advice, recommendations, or help with getting a great deal on your next new car purchase, make sure to visit carhelpcan.com. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.